The election just happened, and what a wild ride that was. I'm sure you're like me and you're super grateful it's all over. However, when it comes to our economy, we may not be out of the woods yet. This is 5 reasons why we may see a recession at the beginning of Trump's term. Recently, Vance, the soon-to-be vice president, was being interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and Tucker was asking JD,
if he gets elected president, once again, do you think they will accept that? So that, are you concerned?
do you think that the left or the establishment is just going to roll over and let you take over and basically do all these things, undo what this last administration has worked on the last 4 years? Do you think they're just going to roll over and take it? And what are your biggest concerns? And JD actually responded with an answer I was not familiar with and I was not prepared for. What JD ended up saying was, actually, no, we are not expecting there to be some sort of 100% peaceful transfer of power without some sort of back channeling vengeance play. In other words, he referenced Liz Truss over in the UK.
The most important and the most impactful way they could try to take down his presidency is by spiking the interest rates. You saw this, by the way, Tucker, Liz Truss in Britain.
Yeah. So if you're not familiar with the story of Liz Truss was kind of like a Trumpian figure. She was very conservative. She ran on lowering taxes and campaigned on lowering taxes. And of course, taxes are high over in the UK. And so she ended up winning. It was kind of a 2016 moment. No one expected it. Well, what ended up happening was the central banks and the deep state or the establishment, whatever adjective you want to use, were in cahoots together to try to sabotage her new prime ministership. And what they did was they raised the bond yields. Now think about it. If you campaign on lowering taxes, that means less revenue coming in. And if the central banks raise the bond yields, that means more money going out to pay your national sovereign debt. And what she basically inherited or came to realize was, oh my gosh, if we lower taxes, we're going to default as a country. Well, you can't default as a country. So she ended up being forced to renege on her promise of lowering taxes. Well, that obviously didn't go over well because she promised to lower taxes and then she can't because of what the central banks did. She was in and out within 42 days. What's the point? The point is that if the central banks and the deep state, the establishment, whatever adjective you want to use, one way they could sabotage the new Trump campaign when they get into office is by raising bond yields. And here's the thing. As of the recording of this video, in the last couple weeks, we have seen bond yields go up 70 basis points. Even with Jerome Powell lowering the federal funds rate, bond yields have gone up, which affects borrowing. It affects our national sovereign debt, paying our interest. It affects getting a mortgage, refinancing. So that's why we've seen the cost of borrowing go up, which can have a major adverse effect on our economy as Trump gets in. This could be deadly if we're not prepared for it. The second reason we could have a recession when Trump gets in is the Fed pivot. Now, what does the Fed pivot mean? Well, I'm going to take you back a couple years. It was September 18th, 2007, and the Federal Reserve Chairman, Ben Bernanke, decided to lower the federal funds rate from 5.25 to 4.75. 50 basis points. I want to take you forward a couple of years. Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, on September 18, 2024, did the exact same thing that Ben Bernanke did a handful of years earlier to the day. He lowered the federal funds rate, also 50 basis points, also going from 5.25 to 4.75. What happened in 2007? We all remember. It was a global financial crisis. But what people don't understand about the Fed pivot is that if you go back to 1969, every single time the Federal Reserve pivots by 50 basis points first, we see a stock market crash shortly thereafter. In fact, you'll see it here on the screen. You can see that back to 1969, every single time that we've seen a Fed pivot, the market goes down on the worst case 58%, and on the best case, 27%. And all of the other reductions in the stock market were somewhere in between. So, is this the first time since 1969 that we have a Fed pivot and don't have a market recession? I don't know. But things aren't looking good in light of what has happened every time the Fed pivots 50 basis points. The third reason we might see a recession when Trump gets into office, and this is the un-inversion of the yield curve. Now, let me explain what the yield curve is. You may have heard of the United States Treasury, or Treasury bonds, Treasury bills, Treasury notes. These are just government instruments of debt. They're bonds, if you would. And so people will buy a Treasury, and the government is going to pay them a certain percentage for the duration of that bond. So maybe it's the 3-month or 6-month or 1-year Treasury, 2-year Treasury, 5, 10, 20, or even 30-year treasuries. Now, a normal, healthy yield curve would mean that the shorter term bonds, the shorter term treasuries, are going to pay less than the longer term treasuries. That's a normal yield curve. It's slowly sloping up the longer the duration of the bond. The problem is that if the shorter term bonds, like the 2-year or the 6-month, end up going higher than the longer term bond or treasury, like the 10-year, that would be a inverted yield curve, which means the optimism level shorter term is higher than the optimism level longer term, like on the 10-year. And anytime we see an inversion in the yield curve where the government debt instrument or the treasury is paying higher for shorter term than it is longer term, you better buckle up. In fact, if you look at the inverted yield curve with the 2-10, so the 2-year and 10-year, or the 6-month and 10-year, every single time there's an inversion, so the shorter term is paying more than the longer term, and then once it finally un-inverts, we have a recession. In fact, this is one of the most predictable and accurate leading indicators for recession going back to the 1950s. The 2-10 and the 6-month 10 have 100% accurately predicted a recession after the inverted yield curve un-inverts. What is the point? You may not have known this, but our yield curve had the longest inversion in history, and it un-inverted in September, and here we are in November, and it's still un-inverted. So maybe this is the first time since the 1950s where that leading indicator is wrong. Maybe not. We'll see. The fourth reason why we might see a recession when Trump gets in is inflation. Jerome Powell recently at the latest Fed funds meeting, the day after the election, talked about how CPI and PPI, which is basically metrics for measuring inflation, is going up. Even with them lowering 50 basis points in September and a quarter basis point in November, inflation is still going up. And that's a problem because if Trump moves forward with tariffs can be good longer term, and it can help get manufacturing jobs back to the United States. But it also can have an inflationary effect on the short term. For example, if we import 80% of our goods and all of a sudden there's a tariff, a 60% tariff on importing those goods into the United States, it's not like we're gonna go from importing 80% to importing 0. People are still gonna have those items. And the people who are getting charged the tariffs, they're not just gonna eat that, they're gonna pass it on to the consumer. Now again, if we get manufacturing rocking and rolling here in America, we're gonna be good once it's up and going, but it takes time to get manufacturing rocking and rolling. So with inflation already creeping back up, and by the way, the metrics that they use don't factor in food, energy, mortgage, and rent, which is 40% of what we spend our money on. So it's already manipulated. So if they're saying that it's going up, it's probably really going up. The point is that if Trump uses tariffs, they can be a very, very helpful tool. But it also can spark the inflation fire to become roaring again in our economy and actually be very problematic for the American middle class. I believe we might be seeing a problem with inflation. It's persistent, and we may have to stop lowering the federal funds rate because inflation, we're not out of the woods yet. Finally, the fifth reason why we might see a recession when Trump gets in is this concept of right track, wrong track. What do I mean? Okay, in 2020, we all remember George Floyd, obviously that terrible situation happened, and we saw riots, we saw BLM and Antifa activated and burning down buildings and streets and cities, looting, killing people. It was insane. And the narrative, okay, or the idea, the notion, the feeling that you were getting, you and I were getting, was that we're on the wrong track. Now, we had an election coming up, and you should vote to get on the right track. Well, we voted. Trump did not win. Doesn't matter what you believe about it, he didn't win. Whether there was election interference or not, who knows, right? But he didn't win. And when Biden got in, BLM, Antifa, the riots, all of it, they're all behaving, right? No more riots, no more burning down cities. And it was almost as if we were on the right track again. Well, then 2022 happened, and we had 2 quarters of negative GDP. The first and second quarter of 2022, we had negative growth in our economy, which by definition was a recession. But the institution that declares when a recession is happening, it's called the National Bureau of Economic Research. A lot of people don't know this, but the National Bureau of Economic Research, much of the executive leadership team was appointed by Obama. So all of a sudden, you have 2 quarters of negative GDP, which is a recession, but here's what happened. Those guys at the National Bureau of Economic Research, they decided, we're gonna change the definition of what recession means.
If things are going so great though, then why is it the White House officials are trying to redefine recession?
No, we're not redefining recession.
If we all understand a recession to be 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth in a row, and then you have White House officials come up here to say, no, that's not what a recession is. It's something else. How is that not redefining recession?
Because that's not the definition. That is not the definition.
Brian Deese said in 2008, of course, economists have a technical definition, which is of a recession, which is 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. They probably got a phone call from Obama and said, listen, we can't have a recession on our watch. Remember, we are on the right track now, so we can't have any bad news. So they censor the truth and they just decide we're going to change the definition. Well, what happens when Trump gets back in? All of a sudden, we're on the wrong track. And you better believe that the infrastructure that the left has used, like the National Bureau of Economic Research, to paint the narrative in their favor, they're probably going to use it to paint the narrative against their opponent, which is Trump. So all of a sudden, we have a recession, and they're going to shout it from the rooftops, and panic sets in, fear sets in, and we have a cascading result. So the point is that this right track, wrong track message or idea for the media and the left and the establishment, we're about to go back to the wrong track. And so they're going to use, I believe, whatever means necessary to cause panic, to cause fear, to cause potential, well, maybe they're going to finally tell the truth for once and say we actually are in a recession. And once they actually declare it, if you look back when the media finally gets it right and starts telling the truth, yes, we're in a recession, things unravel very quickly. So what's the point? The point is, listen, the market rallied after Trump got in. It was awesome. But the sugar high is starting to wear off. We're starting to see that we got fractures in our foundation. And you may want to take a little bit of a defensive strategy going into the first quarter of next year, maybe even second quarter. Once we get this cruise ship finally turned around, I think the market's going to rally big time. But until then, buckle up, be careful, be wise, and make defensive moves and positions in your portfolios, because I don't think we're out of the woods yet. We'll see you on the next video.